Previously on Slope's Game Room's The Complete History of Castlevania, we looked at the original Famicom game, leading up to the release of Dracula X on the Super Nintendo and Rondo of Blood on the PC Engine. If you haven't seen Part 1 yet, the link can be found in the description.
We have come a long way. A decade has passed since Castlevania first found its way into our homes. We've had experimental games, we've had remakes that fans will argue are not remakes. The series has found its way onto handhelds, it's found its way onto systems that were pretty much the competition, and it even got a spin-off too. Kid Dracula was the first spin-off to the series, starting its life on the Famicom back in 1999, getting yet again a sequel, a remake for the Game Boy in 1993, and yes, thankfully this one kept its name worldwide.
Akumajō スペシャル僕ドラキュラ君ファミコンソフトで好評発売中
For long-time viewers of the show, this cutesy, playful take on the gruesome originals may not be uncommon, as the Splatterhouse Complete History showed that even Namco did the same thing with the Wanpako graffiti game. And in this game, you play as Kid Dracula, who might be a kid version of Dracula, or possibly even Alucard himself. It's never truly specified, and honestly, I don't care. If you really are desperate for this to somehow work within the world of Castlevania's already complicated storyline, then you are not the target audience. Kid Dracula for the NES and Kid Dracula for the Game Boy are simply fun, cutesy platformers that are nothing more than that. Simple, fun, and cute. Thankfully they play well too. The games are brilliant fun, and at first you may feel like they're a bit easy, but make no mistake, they get hard. It's refreshing to see such creativity on games like this, and hardcore platforming fans will indeed get a kick out of these hidden gems of the series. Unlike the 14th installment, Castlevania Legends, or Akumajō Dracula Dark Knight Prelude, if you prefer. Belmont's Revenge did such a great job at progressing the rather bland Castlevania the Adventure game, and people had high hopes for this one. The game was released in 1997, the same year as Symphony of the Night, the legendary Symphony of the Night, the game created by the also legendary Koji Igarashi, or Iga as he was more well known. The creepy godfather to some of the greatest games ever created, and when it comes to Castlevania, he's the guy you go to. So what did he think of this particular installment? Well, he hated it so much he removed it from canon, and in an interview he said the following, I quote,
"Legends remains something of an embarrassment for the series. If only that development team had the guidance of the original team of the series."
Yikes! Honestly, it's not that bad. It just, sort of exists. It's honestly a lot better than the adventure, but not as good as Castlevania 2, Belmont's Revenge. It's not all that hard, the level layouts and enemies are pretty basic, and that's it. I wish I could tell you more about it, but to me it just feels like every other game with the difficulty, gameplay, music, and enjoyment dialed down. Play it when you run out of other games to play, I suppose, or I don't know, just play something else. You're not the one making the complete history, you have plenty of games to choose from, and I'm not going to insist that you play Castlevania Legends, but I am going to insist that you play the next game.
Fear has no form. Fear has no name. But now, fear has an address. Castlevania Symphony of the Night for your PlayStation from Konami.
Symphony of the Night. This is a game that I insist and would definitely force you to play. Believed by many to be the absolute high point of the series, And for good reason. It was the first Castlevania that I ever completed, and it is, without a doubt, one of the greatest games ever created, period. Let's do this. Symphony of the Night was part of the Tiger LCD Premier Series and features a slightly different design than the usual Tiger LCD games that you're most likely more used to. As expected, it's pretty basic. You scroll from left to right, you need to attack enemies in front of you and behind with 2 hits, but after upgrading your sword, it only takes 1. Eventually bats get in the way, which you can dodge by platforming up a level or by using the cross, which will eventually be available to you, and after a few boss battles you defeat Dracula, and that's the end of that. Is it as good as everyone makes out though? No, of course it's not. But this is the real Symphony of the Night. It truly is a fantastic game, and for those that have played it, I'm sure you will all agree that plenty of credit is rightfully going to be going to Iga. Not 100% as gaming media would have you believe, but yeah, it's mostly this guy. And with that, it is my absolute pleasure to say, let's go back to the beginning once again.
Playtime's over! Grant me power!
The 17th of March 1968 was the day that this little guy rose from the, well, you know. As he grew up in the city of Shirakawa right next to the Joyama Park in Japan, he became obsessed with looking out of his bedroom window at the Komine Castle, a castle that was almost destroyed during the Battle of Aizu by the pro-imperial army of the Sacho Alliance exactly 100 years before his birth. But Iga didn't care about any of that. He was obsessed with its setting, exploring its somewhat still destroyed architecture and taking a small camcorder along with him, breaking in and day by day venturing further into its darkness as he became more and more brave. An artistic lad with a lumberjack father, Iga actually wanted to follow in his footsteps and instead become a carpenter. That was until he wanted to become an artist, joining the school's art club and then realising he didn't have the talent that the other students did. I mean, the kid is only 10 years old. Give him a break. I'm sure he'll work out exactly what he wants to be and what sort of career path he wants to go down sooner or later, right? Exactly. His uncle was the first to take him down this unknown path that we all know he would eventually take when he introduced him to Pong, or at least a variation of Pong, on one of the hundreds of home Pong consoles of the first generation of gaming. As much as Iga loved this, it actually wasn't until around about 1982 when a friend introduced him to a port of Crazy Climber on a home computer that his interest was officially got. Sadly, Iga's family couldn't afford to get a computer for him, but that didn't stop him. He had his friend's machine to tinker around with, and by simply reading magazines on the subject, he taught himself how to code so that he could make basic games for his friends, as well as a couple of basic ones on display units in small electronic shops. Yes, Iga would actually visit small electronics shops with PCs on display. He would stand there, he would code games in, and then he would leave them for random passers-by to check out. This fascination with game design led him to go deeper down the rabbit hole, and after university he was headhunted by Konami themselves. And of course, he accepted the offer. Who wouldn't? As expected, he started at the bottom, creating educational software and programming tools for other games for the PC Engine. Shortly after, he got his first taste of proper game design in the form of storytelling, as he had to script the story of the company's next dating simulator. Thankfully for him, his girlfriend, who also worked at Konami, helped him out with this project quite a bit, taking him to random great dating hotspots in Japan and giving him plenty of advice for his game. Iga definitely took it on, but when she wasn't looking, he would spend most of his time playing the game that she was working on, which just so happened to be Rondo of Blood. Takemiko Memorial was the dating simulator that he worked on, and it became a huge success for the company in Japan. The bosses were proud with what he did and tried to get him to do a sequel, but Iga refused. He simply couldn't put himself through all of that again. Because of this, the company gave him a list of games for him to work on, and when he saw the words Castlevania, he instantly chose that one. Castlevania Symphony of the Night was the game that Iga set out to create, along with Toru Hagihara, who was the director from the excellent Rondo of Blood game. Taking inspiration from the also brilliant Super Metroid and the Legend of Zelda series, the plan was to take the game in a new direction. More exploration, backtracking, and freedom was the path that Higihara-san and Iga wanted for this new entry. A style that was actually pretty risky. Let's not forget the branching paths of Castlevania 3, although loved retrospectively by Castlevania fans, at the time, didn't do well in the eyes of Konami, and that second game for the NES with its RPG mechanics, well, that really only sold on its name alone, and has aged pretty badly even by 1997 standards. Thankfully, with Rondo of Blood and the Tokimiko Memorial dating sim behind them, and the fact that this was more of a spin-off than a direct sequel, the heads at Konami were not only happy with the new approach, but they pretty much just let them get on with it with practically no interruptions whatsoever. Well, almost none. In fact, one of the greatest games of all time was originally designed for the 32X.
We made an early playable version, but the game did not progress because our company's policy toward the hardware changed. Management decided to make the PlayStation our focus, so we made some drastic changes to our initial ideas and ended up with Symphony of the Night.
Nobody expected Symphony of the Night to be a big deal, that would change the way most Castlevania games would be produced, so they gave it a moderate budget. All they cared about was making sure that it got done. And got it done, they did. The team worked relentlessly on this project, late nights were a common thing, and some of the team members even worked through New Year's 1996.
At midnight, the New Year's bell is rung at temples. I remember being at my desk when the bell tolled. We worked hard then.
By this point, the 32 bits were here, and one of the main driving forces and original ideas for the game was to make it long. A game that wasn't completable in just one sitting, a game that would not only take the player on a journey, but do it in a way that would keep them entertained throughout. The Super Metroid style of gameplay was the perfect way to do this. Changing your character's appearance or abilities to reach certain areas involved lots of backtracking, and it never got tiresome whilst doing so. Not even when the game was heavily expanded on because of one simple feature.
One of the other team members said, "Wait a minute, if we flip the castle upside down during the game, then we'd have twice as much content."
Which they did, and it worked! RPG elements were added too, not only because of his love for the genre, but to change the impression of Castlevania as a whole.
I wanted to change the impression that Castlevania was this difficult to access action game. When we decided to adopt RPG elements, we agreed that users should receive something good when beating enemies. So I thought of adding experience points to the game.
All of these elements created a game like no other before it. It took what made the few games that were in the same genre and the hardcore games in the same franchise, and to the team's surprise, created something that not only dictated the path of the majority of future games in the series, but also it helped spawn the phrase Metroidvania. The name for a genre that has in recent years completely swamped gamers with more indie games than we could ever hope to play. If you've never played a Castlevania game before, I think I speak for everybody watching that has, the hype is real, especially with this particular title. If you've never played it, change that. This game will stick with you for the rest of your life, and by the way, please make sure you do so with a decent pair of headphones on. Here we have a game that blew people away, a brand new direction for the series, a game that would shape all future games, and a game that sold rather well. In Japan, that is. Heck, it was even part of the PlayStation Best Of series too. Konami took big risks by keeping this game 2D when the world, especially the Western world, wanted everything in 3D, as you can see by this terribly aged magazine clip-it.
If you ever needed proof that the Nintendo 64's miles ahead of the 32-bit competition, just compare these shots to the new PlayStation version of Castlevania. Whereas the N64 version features fully 3D characters and backgrounds, along with dazzling lighting effects, the PlayStation title is a flat 2D platform game where the tiny hero has to fight big cheesy monsters. No comparison really.
And because of this, the North American and European releases only sold approximately 60,000 copies each. Differences between the game's releases also helped further spread these numbers, with the inferior Sega Saturn version, with its stretched imagery not looking so good even with its extra hidden areas and extra playable characters from the get-go, and the Western release with slightly different dialogue, music and random character AI changes. Regardless of all of this particular game has garnered itself a huge cult status, and fair play. People around the world want to play this game in every single way possible, and because of that, the prices have shot up and then some. Heck, it's even possible to get a rather good, although obviously not perfect, rendition on several HD systems, such as the 360 with its backwards compatibility, as a download on PS3, PSP, PS Vita, which was honestly the first time I ever played it, and then of course it's unlockable in the Dracula X Chronicles, which we've already mentioned. What I'm trying to say is that there is no excuse. Symphony of the Night is one of the most expensive games you could possibly ever fork out for on the PlayStation 1, but with so many different ways to go about actually playing it, it shouldn't be an issue. That is unless you are all about the 3D, just like the general public was back in 1998, and if that's the case, well, for you we have Castlevania. Yep, just Castlevania, or as the fans like to call it, Castlevania 64, which is a much better name.
MTV Snowed In is brought to you by Konami's Castlevania, now available on Nintendo 64.
Killer outfit. Too bad the nightlife sucks. Dracula returns to Castlevania on Nintendo 64 from Konami.
In order to make up for the failure that was Symphony of the Night, only 1 month after the release of the game, Konami announced that a 3D Castlevania was on the way. It's apparent that by this point, the original team that made Castlevania had been ripped apart and in some cases had been removed completely by this point. As bad as that sounds, it's not necessarily a bad thing when looked at retrospectively, because when they did separate some of these teams, we got games like Rondo of Blood and Symphony of the Night. But Konami wasn't done yet. KCEK was the new team formed by the McDucks up top. They pumped out a couple of forgettable titles, and afterwards they got to work developing Castlevania 64, a very slow developed game. It was apparent that the team rightfully wanted to do the series justice, but it turned out harder than anyone on the team expected. Characters got added, characters got removed, the name went from being called Castlevania 64 in Japan, before reverting back to Dracula 3D and then eventually Demon Castle Dracula Apocalypse before being called simply and annoyingly Castlevania. It was a complete mess. Yet Konami were desperate, and when it was released in the beginning of 1999, it actually did kind of okay. Castlevania 64, which again is 100% what it should have been called, isn't a bad game. Retrospectively, it's aged horrifically, but for the time, again, it did okay. The biggest problem with the game is that it looks as bland and as muddy as a puddle of mud filled with mud on top of it. On top of that, it was littered with all of the usual early platforming traits, cryptic level designs, terrible cameras, and overly jagged characters, and because of the game's overlong development, plenty of games in the same genre had already started to or completely sussed out these annoyances. Castlevania didn't know. For me, it's super hard to go back to a game like this. The audio is great, as you would expect, but I haven't got much else to add to this one. It's not all that fun for me. You may like it. A good game is hidden here. It's just all a bit blur. Now, Castlevania Legacy of Darkness was another game for the N64, and this one actually is the one that you want to be playing. Or to go by its absurd Japanese title, Demon Castle Dracula Apocalypse Gaiden Legend of Cornell. It's games like this that make the Castlevania series just so bloody confusing. What you've got here is yet another attempt at releasing a sort of expanded and remastered version of Castlevania 64. People moan that we get too many remakes nowadays. Well, this one came out only 10 months after the original. Can you imagine if they released a technically unfinished game in this day and age? Oh, no one would ever let them get away with that. Legacy of Darkness is essentially the same game. It's been spruced up regarding its overall look, the characters are different, and you also got new ones in here too. Plus, you even get a few extra levels as well. It's yet again a remake, a remastering, a reimagining, a sequel, a whatever. It's better than this one. Play this one over this one. For me, it's a vast improvement, but for reviewers at the time, it actually scored worse, and because it was kinda technically out already, it even got a very limited run, and yes, because of that, it is now stupidly expensive to get in box. What is it with this franchise? Another year passed before we got our next entry for the incredible Game Boy Advance, Castlevania Circle of the Moon, which had the worst naming ever in PAL regions. Yep, you guessed it, it's called Castlevania. Just Castlevania, again. It was obvious that with Nintendo's latest handheld system that Konami were going to get involved with a new Castlevania game. And obviously because of the system's limitations, a big clunky polygon-filled 3D world just wasn't going to be the way forward. Thanks, Dracula! Instead, we got a game that was a lot more related to Symphony of the Night, and it worked. This game is simply superb, easily one of the best in the series. Yes, it's your typical Metroidvania-like gameplay, not being able to get past certain sections until you gain a new ability, opening up the world bit by bit, and thankfully for a game that is close to being 20 years old by this point, it nails the formula perfectly. In the game, Dracula has awoken, and just as he does, the floor collapses and you have to fight your way through Dracula's dungeon, working your way back up to him. It was a launch title, one of the many actually, and many believe that it shows off the system's capabilities more than any other for the time. The only problem was, for the time, it was super dark. Obviously this isn't the fault of the game designer, but more because of the non-backlit screens of the original hardware. Regardless, it's a great game for any fans of the more Metroidvania style of gameplay if you play it with a backlight. It's just a shame about the naming, right? Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance was the follow-up for the same system that came out only 1 year later, and was the first game to change the name to Castlevania in Japan, where it was known as Castlevania Concerto of Midnight Sun. This is the second game that was produced by Iga, and it's apparent that he wanted to make sure that this game continued on with the formula so brilliantly crafted in Symphony of the Night. And although it's still a perfectly fine Castlevania title, I think it's best we tackle the elephant in the room. Its colour scheme. This game has an almost absurd, overly bright, borderline neon colour scheme. Yep, the game looks more like it was coloured in by a cheap pack of neon markers rather than the usual dark and eerie colour scheme that fans have loved since the very, very beginning. And the reason? Well, That's obvious. The game is this bright due to it working with the hardware limitations for the time. And because of this, it scored pretty well back then, but is often looked at as one of the stranger games in the series for newcomers nowadays. It is also worth pointing out that Iga was forced to get this game out as soon as humanly possible by Konami, and although that hasn't really affected the gameplay all that much, it did affect the music. Harmony of Despair is often cited as being one of the worst, if not the worst soundtrack in the entire Castlevania series. In Castlevania, you never feel bored, backtracking through the castle hundreds of times, and in my opinion, that's mostly because the music takes you along on that journey. Not so much in this game. It dragged a little. Thankfully, the abilities that you unlock really do make the backtracking a bit more fun, and the leveling is also as addictive as it ever was. It's just a shame about that music. But never fear, because whilst this game was being worked on, another Castlevania was also being worked on. Well, actually, there were two games being worked on at this point, but firstly, we have the third Castlevania on the Game Boy, titled Aria of Sorrow. To tackle Harmony's biggest flaw, its music, Iga brought on Symphony's excellent composer, Yoichiro Yamane, to instantly fix those problems, which she obviously did. And to tackle the overly used Gothic setting, he actually set this game in the future. And because of this, the game has quite the different look and feel about it, that honestly, I like. It's actually really refreshing to play a Castlevania that looks like this. And even though the story is as throwaway as they come, I never cared for that when I'm exploring ridiculously sized castles and slaying endless amounts of bad guys, leveling up and pumping myself up listening to the awesome soundtracks. Aria of Sorrow ticks all of these boxes. And thankfully, this wasn't the only new feature that they added. The ability to absorb souls is this game's gimmick that actually changes up the gameplay a fair bit. Depending on the enemy you kill, it will determine the type of soul that you acquire, and in turn will give you extra abilities that were previously unavailable to you. This is such a big deal because there are a serious amount to collect. Add this with your own personal choice of attack and it's pretty much guaranteed that you will be playing the game completely uniquely to the vast majority of other people that have also played it. Also, not to give too much away, this game is full of those, oh wow, look at those incredible boss moments. Aria of Sorrow is yet another perfect example as to why so many people love this franchise. It's an excellent game and well worth your time. In fact, it's so good that it got a sequel on the DS. But not before a lovely double pack showed up, which I had the pleasure of unboxing for this documentary. And by the way guys, if you want a cheap way of playing two of the best games in the series and you don't mind having it unboxed, this is the cartridge to get. And also, we didn't get that sequel to Aria of Sorrow straight away, because first we got the PlayStation 2 attempt at not only making Castlevania 3D once again, but doing it well. Did they succeed in doing so? Yes, actually. I'm always going to prefer the 2D Metroidvanias and the 16-bit bad boys, but this 3D Castlevania was actually quite the surprise. Not in the naming, of course, because this is yet another Castlevania game in the series that is just called Castlevania in Japan. And the reason for this is that Castlevania Lament of Innocence was set in the 11th century, 1094 to be exact, making it the true origin story for the entire franchise. Changing the relatively easy by comparison creation of the 2D games and converting them to 3D was no easy task. Take the N64 games for example. Two, or should I say 1.5 games that actually took inspiration from outside sources and tried their best to slap a Castlevania skin on top. Of course, this was not what Iga wanted to do for this game. He wanted to take what made his Igavania games, as they were now known to some, and translate that style into 3D rather than taking inspiration from elsewhere.
We've extended a 2D game style into 3D, but 3D has a very different environment. It's really obscure comparatively. Having a 3D environment is not as precise as it was with the 2D. The good point about 3D gaming is bringing the actual reality-based environment to gaming. The dynamics of audio, of the graphics, bring a new reality to life.
With that said, it's hard to not see inspiration from other titles, huh? Looking at you, Devil May Cry.
Rest in peace.
Personally, I can't stand this style of a fixed camera in a 3D game. It does work during the big battle sequences, but in so many others, mistakes can be made due to not seeing everything that's within your character's eye line. Regardless, if you stick with it, you will learn to live with it, and for hardcore fans, I suggest you do. The core of what makes Castlevania great is here with this game, leveling up your character, exploring a castle, simple platforming and gradually increasing bosses until you get to the end, which is where the story unfolds itself to explain the beginning of the franchise. Castlevania Lament of Innocence is a surprisingly good game with a stunning PlayStation 2 collector's set, I might add. Certain elements have aged somewhat, but thankfully after a short while of playing it, you soon pick up on that 6th generation console gameplay. And most importantly for this video, it did well enough to garner itself its own sequel in 3D, which is great for the people that follow that. But not before the sequel to Aria of Sorrow came out that was set 942 years after Lament of Innocence, called Dawn of Sorrow. This series jumps about. Dawn of Sorrow is pretty much Aria of Sorrow, but now it's for the Nintendo DS. I mean, that makes sense, right? It worked well the first time, and it works well this time. Sadly, the art style got changed up, and unfortunately the game does force a few touchscreen controls onto you that really don't add anything to the gameplay. But you soon get used to them and you continue on your way. All in all, there really isn't much else to add. Everything you love about the games up to this point, especially Aria of Sorrow, can be found here. The top screen now works as a map or stat screen, which is an excellent addition. The music is still utterly fantastic, it's simply great fun that works before and it still works now. Ayami Kojima, the series' main artist from the Symphony of the Night up until now, was obviously not present here, as seen by that new art style that was here to attract a young Japanese crowd, and this of course was intentional, because obviously only kids have Nintendo DS's, and because of that, it didn't sell that well. Putting all that aside, it's actually a great game, but few people cared about it outside of the hardcore fans. Thankfully, this did mean that Kojima-san could work on the next game in the series called Castlevania Curse of Darkness, which by the way not only had an awesome Japanese cover thanks to the Japanese text, but also was the only physical released original Xbox game in the franchise. It's time to go back to the 6th generation of consoles for the second 3D Castlevania in this new series and 3rd and a half overall, Castlevania Curse of Darkness. This one finally changes the fixed camera perspective to a third-person gameplay style, and I really like that. Now granted, I did learn to not mind the fixed camera style of the previous game, but this one feels more like what a proper 3D Castlevania should look like. The levels can become overly repetitive to look at and to tackle from time to time, but because of its RPG mechanics, it never feels a slog to get through. As always, the music is fantastic and the sense of accomplishment as you work your way through is apparent throughout your playthrough. After playing it again, I'm actually in two minds as to which one I prefer out of these two new 3D Castlevania games. They're both different enough from each other to make them both stand on their own 2 feet, which honestly is far more creative than quite a few of those 2D titles. The game even featured a 2-volume manga that tells the story between this game and Castlevania 3 before it, and was very well received. Portrait of Ruin came along next, or as it was known in Japan, Gallery of Labyrinth, and at first glance it may look like just a standard Igavania type game that is looked at as being one of the best in the series, when in actual fact, yeah, it's looked at as being one of the best in the series. Again, seriously guys, these games are fantastic. So, Portrait of Ruin has a gimmick. Sure, all the games have a gimmick, but this one feels a lot more gameplay intrusive. That's not a bad thing, as stated, this is one of the best, because in this game you are controlling 2 people at once. At first this may sound like a bit of an annoyance, but in actual fact when you play it you soon realise that it's done in a way to mix up the exploration. Surprisingly, the more you play this, the more you will forget this. It feels like you're playing as just one thing, a thing that has the ability to acquire more skills than a single player thing normally does. You got your standard gameplay style with one character and a magic based character that's a lot more exciting to watch and experiment with for the other. Both characters complement each other's gameplay style, and for my Sega nuts out there, it's kinda like playing Axel and Blaze at the same time. Ha ha ha, yes! Anyway, back to Castlevania. You can use these characters' own abilities and playstyles as you wish, but on top of that, you can actually call in the other player to assist you with whatever you have assigned them, which results in yet even more gameplay mix-ups. And yes, just like before, the top screen is used to see your stats or map, which I absolutely adore. Another amazing feature of this game is the ability to enter these paintings on the wall all Mario 64 styly and explore areas outside of the game's main story. Don't get me wrong, I love the standard settings for Castlevania games, but the little mix up here is a huge selling point for me. Someone who has exhausted most of these games like me can now take these excellent characters to different worlds. Sadly, it does kick down the overall size of the map, almost making it a little linear, but you know, that's okay. For me, it's a good mix-up to the formula. The game also featured online gameplay via time trials and was done in a way to test this new style for future titles. I personally didn't get the opportunity to try this myself, but from what I can tell in reviews for the time, it was actually pretty well received and added a nice change of pace for a series that is still not finished. The Dracula X Chronicles would pop up after this one, as would the Adventure Rebirth download WiiWare game, which we've already covered, and you even had another spin-off slot its way into this period, this time for the Nintendo Wii. Castlevania Judgment, which has excellent cover art, looking even better in Japan because who doesn't love those unreadable characters on their box art, was a Castlevania one-on-one fighting game. This game isn't actually as bad as reviewers would have you believe. Yes, it doesn't follow the classic Castlevania formula, and yes, regarding one-on-one fighters, it's not all that deep. It's simply a good for the time looking fighting game that plays very similar to your average one-on-one fighting game. Don't expect massive chains tied together to make crazy combos. You learn your moves, your few specials, and block everything else. Released at a time when not releasing games on the Wii was a stupid thing to do if you was a big publisher, Castlevania Judgment came out at a good time for the company. Iga wanted to take the new control system and implement it into a standard game, but thought that it would be too tiring after long playthroughs. Because of this, with motion controls still at the forefront, this new style was added instead, and that was that. The characters were slightly redesigned by Takeshi Obata of Death Note fame, and, well, honestly, it's actually pretty refreshing. Would a 2D game have been better? Definitely. But we got so many of those. I say good job to Iga and his team for making a very casual one-on-one fighter that actually has a surprising amount of depth. I'm glad we never got a sequel to this, but for what it is, I'm fine with it. And finally, before getting back to the main games, you've got this. Yes, it's a rail shooter game, but instead of a gun, you need to aim and whip. Look, I don't think anybody was asking for this, and in actual fact, it doesn't look like it's done all that well. The arcade unit came out in Japan and got a very limited test run in the UK and hasn't been seen since, leaving just the Order of Ecclesia showing up before the series took one final drastic change. The Stolen Seal, as it was known in Japan for the Nintendo DS, was the final 2D Castlevania game that we got, and my god guys, did they go out with a bang. You are probably expecting more of the same. We all know what a Castlevania game is by this point, and technically this is more of the same. However, for the final 2D Castlevania game for a handheld, they polished this one to the nth degree. This title is an absolute joy to not only play, but to see. The team really have pushed the DS to its limits here, and it's seen with the overall presentation dropping the cutesy let's appeal to the younger kids art style and replacing it with the classic Castlevania look that we all prefer. Yes, all of us. The new attraction for this game is within its new character, Shinoa, and the fact that the game is set outside of a castle, you find yourself saving villagers and going on quests in return for rewards that will often grant you new abilities. And although these may seem a little mundane, they are for the most part pretty interesting and different from one another to garner interesting gameplay styles. Just like the previous games, the bottom screen is where all of the action lies, and the top is for your map and your stats. And as this was an incredibly late entry in the DS's life, the desperation to add some kind of touch mechanic is thankfully completely absent. Order of Ecclesia is good solid Castlevania fun that is light on exploration and grinding, as well as being light on its singular pathed areas. It's the best of both worlds, blended with obviously fantastic music and some of the best visuals of any of the 2D adventures. Shinoa has the unique ability to absorb glyphs in this game through the tattoo on her back apparently, which can be assigned to your X and Y buttons and then can be used with the game whilst holding up and these buttons to unleash some rather spectacular screen clearing attacks, or even completely change the way your character looks and moves around the maze-like levels. Overall, it adds yet another twist to the classic Metroidvania genre. The enemies are some of the most experimental the series has ever seen, and still, God knows how many games in, they are an absolute sight for sore eyes when you come up against them. You may be thinking to yourself that by this point, the gameplay style is getting boring, but Iga and his team added so much to this game that yet again, it's not boring. You've got lush environments, incredible ear-melting music, and a gameplay style that, yet again, it doesn't get boring. And if that's still not experimental enough for you, then of course you can check out Harmony of Despair. Honestly, before the days of truly understanding why this series is so great, this was my first experience with the downloadable Xbox 360 game, which by the way does actually have backwards compatibility. Thank God. And as good as this is, if I could go back and advise the 2010 version of DJ Slope that had never played a Castlevania game before that date, I would say do not play this game. Not yet anyway. Castlevania Harmony of Despair, which is a play on H and D, is essentially a multiplayer mashup of the majority of 2D Castlevania games before it, filled with sprite work from those games in, well, HD. This game is really only for people that well, people that have made it this far into the video, and not for newcomers. In this game, you get to choose from the majority of characters from those 2D titles, and you have 6 castles to tackle in a cooperative styled formula. This has obviously never been done before, and just like the games that these characters originated in, they all play rather differently. You will need to be working together to get past certain sections, or to trigger actions that will affect other areas of these huge maps. You will start off incredibly weak, but over time, you can upgrade your characters, fail, start again, upgrade your characters, fail, start again, upgrade your characters, fail and start again, and each time you do, you will perfect your style and your character, getting closer and closer to the final boss of that stage until you have it nailed. This may sound tedious to some, although I'm guessing that anyone 50-ish minutes into a video like this wouldn't mind. And again, I really like this formula, now that I've played the games that these characters have originated from. Obviously it's crazy different from everything that came before it, and considering we had got 2D Castlevanias almost yearly for about a decade before this, I applaud Konami for doing a game like this. Newcomers will likely hate it, but old school fans, especially the hardcore fans with a good group of like-minded Castlevania fans, will indeed get a kick out of this one. And yes, Castlevania obviously made its way onto mobile phones too, and then some. Now, most of these entries are of course ports of already released games with varying levels of success, such as Castlevania Puzzle Encore of the Night, which retells the story of Symphony of the Night, but this time, instead of action platforming, you play a game of Connect 4 Colors, working your way through the mansion. Does this sound like it's up your street? No, not me either. Regardless, surely it's better than the cancelled Game.com Symphony of the Night, right? What is addictive as all hell, however, is some of the random Konami puzzle collections that use Castlevania sprites, such as the dangerously addictive Pixel Puzzle Collection game, which is essentially Picross for those that don't know. And besides all of this, you actually have a couple of officially released Castlevania mobile exclusives too. Order of Shadow came out back in 2007. It's a Java-made entry that, just like pretty much all Java games, is virtually impossible to play, even if Ego was reportedly involved since the very beginning, apparently. Honestly, I think this is probably the best they could have done considering what they actually had to work with. It's far from enjoyable to play nowadays, but again, say fair play for at least giving it a go, right in the heart of the GBA and DS releases. More recently, Castlevania Grimoire of Souls was released for mobile phones, and although I haven't actually played this particular one, it apparently, although arguably not as good looking, plays quite well considering the touchscreen controls. It's yet again got the most popular characters from the franchise in it, and you need to unlock them as you play. For a mobile game, it honestly looks and plays quite well. Sadly though, this is a free-to-play game, meaning that yes, you need to grind like all hell to gain gems or crystals or whatever to boost up your character. Obviously, later levels have enemies, including the same enemies, but this time with more hit points, requiring you to either be stronger or bloody brilliant at platforming on a mobile phone to take them on. It's a pretty typical platforming fare in that regard. Sure, it controls better, but that desperate attempt for you to open up your wallet can be seen throughout your playthrough, and for most retro gamers that actually would get a kick out of this, it's doubtful you will ever want to play it for very long. Which is a good thing because it's now no longer available to download and the ability to purchase gems has been removed from the game. If by this point you still don't understand why Castlevania is so great, well, then I can't help you. Castlevania is a stupidly good series, for the most part. You can easily split the series into 3 parts by this point, with the 3D games being the weakest, and in my opinion, the straightforward non-Metroidvania games coming in second. Of course, your mileage may vary, heck even mine does with certain entries. Covering every game up to this point has showcased just how much the world loves Castlevania, and as you may have guessed, as demonstrated several times in this very video, quite a few of these highly sought after games nowadays didn't actually sell all that well when originally released. I mean, they did fine, well enough to get, quite frankly, a stupid amount of sequels, prequels, remakes, remasters and reimaginings, and that's because, even though the fan base got smaller, or should I say more niche, the simple fact of the matter is Konami wasn't all that impressed with the overall sales figures of some of those final games. As stated, some of the very best ones. And in response to this, they had yet another attempt at making Castlevania 3D. Sure, it didn't work the first time, and well, I suppose it kind of did the second time, but again, not to the level that they were hoping for. Castlevania deserves to be not just a standard 3D action platforming game that gets lost in the wild. This universe is so incredibly rich that it deserves to be so much more. It was well known at the time that Konami wanted to bring Castlevania once again into the 3D space like never before. And because of this, quite a few prototypes found their way into the hands of Konami before they finally accepted Mercury Steam's pitch. But what you may not know is that this game didn't even start as a Castlevania game. And at this point in time, it wasn't good enough for Konami, resulting in the game almost getting cancelled. That was until David Cox got involved, pushed this onto the higher ups in Japan, they loved it, and before you know it, Hideo Kojima was involved. Yes, that Hideo Kojima. And well, having these two produce the game was obviously going to be a win-win situation for Konami. After that, it was quickly changed into a Castlevania title, and Lords of Shadow was born.
これスカッとするでしょ。悪魔城のね、最新作なんですよ。
吉田よ、それ全部俺が教えたことじゃないか。
あれ？まだいたんだ。
吉田！キャッスルバニア。
PlayStation 3. Castlevania Lords of Shadow. It's time to take that absurdly complicated story that's been building up over the last 20 plus years, a story that Iga himself has personally approved to be a part of the original Castlevania canon, or not, with every single release, and bury it deep. Castlevania Lords of Shadow is a hard reboot for the series in every single way possible. Sure, it has the Belmonts, but not a whole lot else. The game takes some inspiration from the first game and Super Castlevania 4, but for the most part, it's an entirely new series. With that said, the original intent for Castlevania was to make it feel cinematic, and although this next statement is most definitely going to rip my audience right down the middle, it's hard to deny that this is anything but cinematic. And with that in mind, this new style that they're going for, in my opinion, has finally been nailed. Never has a 3D game felt this good to play. Again, I prefer the older styles, but this is still exactly, you know, what they are going for. And for that, I say fair play. As you can see, the gameplay looks to be a mix of typical 3D person action games like Shadow of the Colossus and God of War's earlier titles, and it plays just like them too. The soundtrack fits well to this new style, however nothing really jumps out like it did before. Again, it's kind of what they're going for. The voice acting as well is pretty top notch overall. And well, I think it's fair to say that if you like the look and sound of a game like this, then it's not really going to disappoint you. The game is very gory. It's a lot more linear than the Iga generation, and although many might not like what they did with this beloved series, let me tell you that this game is actually perfectly fine. Yes, for those that are upset with what Konami did to their beloved Castlevania, let me tell you that this is actually a good game.
Dark tyrants need a dark hero. Castlevania Lords of Shadow.
By this point, Castlevania has become a little bit generic. I'm not knocking it. I love that style of gameplay and I would happily play this style of gameplay every single year until the day I die. However, it's been going on for a while and a change up was definitely needed. Lords of Shadow is that change up and it's a good change up. Lords of Shadow is simply a perfectly fine game. The death animations make it non-forgettable. Seriously, this game is gory as all hell. The puzzles never felt taxing. Same goes for the exploration, honestly. I had a perfectly adequate amount of fun with this title. For me, it doesn't really remind me of Castlevania. Again, it feels like its own thing, and that's exactly what it is. Lords of Shadow is fine. I doubt I'll ever play it again, even though it does tick all of the right boxes. It just doesn't do anything extra that makes it legendary. And again, that's fine, I suppose. It is what it is. Also, in case you was interested, this game has a stupid amount of different editions and collector sets, more than any other in recent memory, and especially in the Castlevania series. Seriously, it's got so many. It got 2 DLC packs and then they got added into more collector sets of sorts, and yes, they were released too, and it did well enough via all of these different revisions of the game to get a couple of sequels that also got stupidly big collector sets with little action figures that honestly feel very cheap. And that sequel, yep, it plays beautifully, it's stunning, compared to the original, that is. But before that, you've got the 3DS game that is actually a mix of the old and the new. It's a 2.5D platformer designed to not only please the relatively happy newer Castlevania fans and bring in the old school crew too. Sadly, being almost 2D, that's pretty much as far as it goes when it comes to the classic Castlevania formula. This is a Lords of Shadow game trying to be a classic Castlevania game, and it's not.
Castlevania Lords of Shadow Mirror of Fate was announced on June the 5th for Nintendo 3DS, and the buzz around the show has been really good. This is a sequel to the original game, Castlevania Lords of Shadow, so when players play the game, they're going to get this really cool action combat game, but with a feeling of nostalgia from the classic Castlevania series. So what you're going to see with this game is kind of really beautiful graphics, really lovely 3D, but also kind of viewed from a 2.5D side-scroller perspective. But we do occasionally use the stereoscopic cameras to actually go into the world in real 3D. It looks like a miniature diorama, and it's fantastic, and that's what people have really picked up on at the show.
The fighting feels awful, the exploration is boring, and the controls are stiff. This is a game trying to do so many things and failing at every single one of them. Thankfully the music is good, and thankfully your 3DS can play DS games because you're much better off doing that exact thing. Anyway, back to Lords of Shadow 2. This time it's taken a bit more of a wacky approach, with you going up against enemies in odd settings that feel very much out of place within the world of Castlevania and Lords of Shadow. Even though I actually did quite enjoy the almost completely linear style of the original, the team wanted the follow-up to be more exploration-based. 3D games can do this. The insanely good Batman Arkham series proves that, and then some, and honestly, it kind of works here too. But again, I'd much rather play other games like the Arkham series. With that said, Lords of Shadow 2 is not a bad game, and it looks really good. It has gameplay style changes throughout and a lot more characters to interact with, but for me, it's become even more removed, not just from the original Lords of Shadow, but also Castlevania as a whole, whilst at the same time desperately trying to latch on to what made it great in the first place. The sequel ends up being a really weird mix of confusing design choices that didn't exactly sit too well with me. With endless amounts of games to play, it's unlikely that this one will be anywhere near the top of anybody's list. The world of Castlevania is absolutely massive. I think that goes without saying. a crazy amount of sequels, spin-offs, remasters, prequels, reboots, TV shows, cameos, cancelled games, and of course, Castlevania merch still get released to this very day. After all, you're not a real Castlevania fan until you get the official Simon's Quest batteries, am I right? Surprisingly, the recently released TV show has actually served as a more than surprising way for the series to, well, end. Yes, Castlevania Moonlight Rhapsody is still apparently on its way again for mobile phones, but honestly, I don't think anyone here is expecting me to update this complete history for this one, right? Yep, the TV show has done a fantastic job of keeping the name alive, originally starting off as a direct-to-video movie adaptation of Castlevania 3. Warren Ellis, the guy who was contracted to create the movie, found working with Iger incredibly difficult. 8 full rewrites were forced by the man himself until further bigwigs got involved, further complicating the whole process. It was quickly understood that a simple 90-minute movie wouldn't be enough time to tell the full story of Castlevania, and before you know it, a trilogy of movies were even drafted. A long time passed, and then in 2012 it was reported that Adi Shankar, who had just finished his work on Dread, had seen what was supposed to be a Castlevania-like film in the style of Underworld and quickly turned it down due to his love for the franchise. According to him, it just felt 250% wrong. Thankfully, however, the show was picked up by Netflix after Powerhouse Animation Studios got involved and turned it into a series, taking inspiration from Symphony of the Night, as well as anime such as Ninja Scroll and Vampire Hunter D. The show aired in 2017 and is now well into its 3rd season, with hopefully plenty more to come. Even though it's been an incredibly long time since the almost endless amounts of Igavania games out there, the fans still want more, and Koji Igarashi actually did give us more when he went to Kickstarter and he very successfully funded Bloodstained. A Kickstarter which received rave reviews and to this day is still providing updates to its backers. Besides this, in recent years, again, besides the odd cameo, Castlevania has had the odd collection pop up and the odd port on the odd mini system. But other than that, it's erotic pachinko time. Something that I would love to say nobody was asking for, but they just keep making them. People are obviously playing these absurd spin-offs and then some. You may be surprised to hear that the soundtracks on these machines are pretty damn impressive actually. I think the problem is, this is what we are getting in place of the excellent Castlevania games. If they were released alongside the standard games, I seriously don't think anyone would mind. Heck, older bingo and poker machines featured Kid Dracula were popping up in the mid-90s and nobody cared then. Regardless, as much as I am supposed to hate these things, they are absolutely fascinating to me. If I ever get to Japan, you can be damn sure I'm going to go find these machines and I'm going to be playing them. And at the end of the day, we have more than we will probably ever get the chance to finish here. It is still the hardcore retro gamer that wants the classics to continue. Sure, by this point it's unlikely Iga will ever return. After all, he's doing more than fine without Konami's help. But for me, as long as the fans continue to show respect for the classics in the console space, I am personally happy to wait just a little bit longer. Plus, it's gonna take us long enough to collect all of the physical games anyway, right? Hey there guys, thanks for checking out the video. Before we go ahead, let's give another massive shout out to Quang, who lent me his entire Castlevania collection for the purposes of this video. Thank you so much, my friend. As stated in the last video, if you want to go and check out his awesome new game, Super Jetpack DX, then you can indeed do that very thing for the Game Boy Color using the link down below, and I highly suggest you do so. It's something that I personally purchased and I'm a big fan of it. Go and do that very thing. Yeah, let's also give some shout outs to the people that actually helped make this video with their voiceovers, that being Wang, Top Hat Gaming Man, and Erin Plays, another 3 amazing channels. I'm sure you know who they are already, but if not, their links will be in the description. And as always, let's give another massive shout out to all of the patrons and YouTube members that help make videos like this every single week. And if you want to be part of these awesome YouTubers that get to see videos early, see what I'm working on, see early previews of what I'm working on, extra rooms in my Discord chat, there's so many other things, then please do consider becoming a YouTube or Patreon member. Links can be found in the description. Now let's give a big shout out to the following. Aaron Gorman, Agent Smith, aka Retro Gamer, Andrew Dalton, Andrew Ward, Arista, Benjamin Guy, Big Rico, Bram Perez, Brandon Gold, Caesar, Cheshire One, Chris the Shapeshifter, Christopher Di Vivero, Clan Bob, Conrad Constantine, Cromilla, Control, Alt Reese, Daniel Tarares, David Yaron, Dina81, Dominic Devonport, Game Apologist, Gary Pinkett, Hut, Ignacio, Jesus, Krato, Carasido, Intrigued Gaming, Jay is Manchild, Jabba Al Aiden, Jacob P, aka Avalon James, Jeff Ladd, Jeff Mianowski, Jeremy Rodriguez, Jonathan Haywood, Kevin Heaton, Kinglink Reviews, Lucas Softail, Lit, Man of God 9000, Man Shovel, Marcus Kingimo Cut, Tyndall, Michael Towns, Mind of the Unsane, Nicholas Bertner, Nick Pollard, Nightwill, Petty Mew, Pretendo64, Riol Van Pruigen, RetroReversing.com, Retro to Next Gen, aka Lou, Richard Alderjic, Richard Carter, aka Fantastic Dizzy, Rocket Plod, Rovan Army, Ryan Holtz, Sashi Dog, Samuel Nielsen, Shade Silence, Shadow Dragon, Solix Captor, Stephen, Taylor Rainwater, That Gamer, The Cunning Linguist, The Shaded J, Tim Labonte, Tim Lunn, Todd Paul Float G, Trans Rights, Vike Echo, Wobbles and Bean, The Wonder Ducks, and Ye Old Hamburglar. Like I said, guys, if you want to be part of these awesome people, then you can do that very thing by clicking those links below, and it will be much appreciated. You help make videos like this every single week. Thank you all so much for finally watching the Castlevania, The Complete History. It's been a massive video to have done, and I'm just so happy I've finally managed to do a video this big. Does that mean I can start doing other ones? You know, maybe a bit of Zelda, maybe a bit of Final Fantasy? Oh, the answer is no. Much love, everyone. DJ Soap signing out, and hopefully I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.